we as Kurd-Akad UK would like to welcome you all here this evening. Today's seminar is, our speaker today is Dr. Argun Çakir, and the topic of the seminar is Categorisation of Peripatetics in Kurdistan, Patronage, Music Making, and Ethnography. I would like to briefly, just very briefly talk about Kurd-Akad UK, who we are. We as Kurd-Akad UK were established end of 2019, just before the troubles coronavirus year started. We are a non-profit organization based in UK. There are other Kurd-Akads across Europe, in Germany, Switzerland, Netherlands, and more to come. It is a networking-based organization. Our aims are empowering the education among the Kurdish diaspora, mainly promoting academic work, strengthening public relations, and so on. I would like to now start with again reminding topics of today. Dr. Argun Çakir will be talking with the title of Categorisation of Peripatetics in Kurdistan, Patronage, Music Making, and Ethnography. Dr. Argun Çakir is an anthropologist and ethnomusicologist specializing on the peripatetics mode of subsistence with a geo-cultural focus on Kurdistan. For his PhD in Kurdish Studies at University of Exeter, he researched the socioeconomic transformation of peripatetics groups, who are notably integral to the region's musical landscape in the area around Mardin or Mêrdîn in Kurdish, in southeastern Turkey or northern Kurdistan. His ethnomusicological work focuses on Kurdish sung oral literature and its performance, especially their role in Kurdish nation building and the kemaçe performance tradition around Mêrdîn. He currently works as a postdoctoral research assistant at the Department of Music, University of Bristol. Argun is one of the very few good examples that I met throughout my research here in the UK, who started with, when I met his Kurdish speaking was at the very beginning level, and in a very short time he managed to not only learn Kurmanji Kurdish, but also have a very local accent of Nisebin area where his research was based. As Kurtasi bi Kurdiji khairhatına ve bıkım, İro mevaneme Dr. Argun Çakir ve ser mjara khoya doktoraya khoya qısad kir bimere. Argun tu khairati از نها میکروفون دادم تا و 45 دقیقه تا هي بجبو سمینار ایرو پشتیوی پرسو برسبن خو او بکن و ایوارا خو بخوشی بخزینن. As we will try to benefit from Argun's multilinguistic ability, therefore you can raise your questions not only in English, but also in Kurdish where desired. Hun ishev باشا پرس برسویل هندکارن پرسین خواب کردی جی پیشکش بکن جبرکو آرگون کردی کی پاکش دزانه و قصد که Argun, the floor is yours. Thank you for accepting this invitation of Kurd-Akad and being our guest this evening. Thank you very much.
Well, thanks for the great introduction, Mithat, and thanks to Kurd-Akad for having me. And marhaba jwara tabta, shabab bkhair, bkhairaten. Yeah, I'll try to do this as conversational as possible. I think that's, that's going to be the main register. If it sounds like I'm reading at certain points, that's because I will be reading. But yeah, I'll introduce you to why the subject and why I talk about it in this fashion, and all the other details during the talk. Well, I have a few good friends already in the audience. It's a small crowd, but I really like small crowds, so I'm quite happy about it. And so those of you who may have heard my name or heard me speak before will probably know me as an ethnomusicologist, but I've been fancying myself as an anthropologist since, I don't know, 2013 or 14. But this is the first time I actually will be presenting from my anthropological research, and I'm super excited about it. And I hope that you will find the subject interesting. So the subject of my talk tonight is the categorization of peripatetics in Kurdistan. And I will use a particular case study, the case study of peripatetics in the area around the city of Mêrdîn in my talk. In other words, generally speaking, I will talk about the people Kurds identify, depending on the area they hail from, as Matribo, Karachi, or Karaj, or Gawanda, or Ashik, or Asik, or Elekji, or Kalaji, or Duman. There are a lot of names, and these are really local names, mind you. And there seems to be kind of like a general tendency in both academic research and among kind of like in the daily speech among the Kurds themselves, to take these names to denote distinct bounded groups, distinguished from one another by various factors, but most importantly, mobility versus sedentariness, or according to their economic practices, etc. I mean, there's quite a few of these factors. And in this talk, I will try to tell a different story in a way. I will focus only on the peripatetics in the Mêrdîn area and kind of show you the kind of like the life of these terms in the 20th century, and how basically local Kurds understand these terms, what they mean, how these, like, what kind of groups they refer to, and how these groups function, and kind of what this means in practice and everything. And obviously, like, the kind of large-scale change that all of this has undergone in the 20th century, but it's a story that is not told very often. So I think that's why I have the term ethnography, because this story is not actually acknowledged by the locals, and ethnography allows you to kind of like find yourself in the middle of tension between different understandings of these terms, and basically the kind of tension about how they changed and what those changes might mean. Anyhow, basically, there's one thing about this talk. I'm not going to talk a lot about how peripatetics themselves understand these categories. I will give insight into those, but I'm mostly concerned about local Kurds. Now, mind you, I say local Kurds, but basically the Christians in the area, Arabs in the area, and all the other groups in the area use either the exact same words or similar words, and mean similar things. But, in order to not kind of like commit any mistakes, because I didn't do research with Christians in the area or Arabs, I did research only with the Kurds. So I will limit kind of like the kind of subject non-peripatetic people of this talk to Kurds. Well, it's just I need to warn you, it's a decidedly complicated story, this whole thing. And I'm still trying to find the right narrative flow. And this is me kind of testing it in a way. And this is something that I want to write an article on. So I've already had some of these ideas kind of cooking in my head. So I will try to present them to you kind of, rather haphazardly, but I hope you'll be able to follow most of it. Anywho, so maybe I should first start with something really basic. You may have noticed that I use the term peripatetic in the title. Yeah, the term is not that popular, even among scholars. Most people prefer ethnic names nowadays, but peripatetic actually refers to a mode of subsistence. This is something that some anthropologists, a handful of anthropologists, kind of realized starting from the late 70s onwards. And those are kind of the heydays, late 70s until maybe the mid 80s. These people were studying groups which you might recognize by such names as Roma or Dom or Sinti, or I don't know, if you study Turkey, you might know Abdals, you might know Tahtacis, I don't know. Also in common kind of English kind of speech, daily speech, let's say, and previously in academic kind of jargon, they were known as gypsies. So peripatetic adaptation is the result of these scholars realizing that these people have similar lifestyles, similar social positions within the societies that they exist, and kind of, similar kinds of social organization, a lot of different things actually. Not because they have common origins, not because they all come from India or something, that kind of story that's told over and again all the time. You hear it from everybody, like even the most respected scholars will tell you that story. And yet the reality is a lot of these people did not come from India. Yeah, maybe this lifestyle may have kind of spread from there, we don't know. But origins is not why these commonalities can be observed. The reason is they practice a common mode of subsistence. And by mode of subsistence, I mean a way to make a living. That other examples will clarify it for you. Hunting and gathering is a mode of subsistence. Pastoralism is a mode of subsistence. Agriculturalism is a mode of subsistence. Yet, as popular as these three terms, for instance, three modes of subsistence are, peripatetic adaptation is not. Now, let me kind of introduce what it means. So Aparna Rao was one of the kind of main proponents of this idea of the peripatetic adaptation. And her definition is quite good, actually. She defines peripatetic groups broadly as primarily non-food producing / extracting, preferentially endogamous, itinerant communities subsisting mainly on the sale of goods and or more or less specialized services to sedentary and or nomadic customers. And by nomadic, she is referring to pastoralists. So basically, if I kind of make this, elaborate on it a little bit, open it up, what she says is these people don't produce food by tending the soil, by keeping animals, but they actually acquire the food through people who do those things. So they actually take food from agriculturalists. They take food from pastoralists. They might gather a certain amount and they might keep a few animals, right? This is like an ideal category. As any ideal category, it does not exist in the real world. Just like you won't have a group that is 100% pastoralist, because they might actually keep a few kind of plants in their garden, or agriculturalists often keep a few animals, sometimes even a few 100, right? So these are ideal categories. And basically, in my mind, when I think about how I can define a peripatetic group or the peripatetic adaptation itself, I think they largely use other humans as their resources, not animals, not soil, other humans, which is quite unique actually. And one of the other things Oh, apologies for that, just a moment. Sorry about the noise. Basically, the other thing, which is quite interesting, and it comes up a lot, and most of you may have heard this before, and the word itinerant referred to it. These communities are known as mobile communities. But at the same time, as the anthropologists who actually wrote the kind of like the peripatetic adaptation literature, as they realized, it doesn't mean that they're 100% mobile. They can actually become sedentary and then become mobile again, depending on the circumstances. They are flexible people. They actually move around, but if they want to actually stay still for a bit, settle for a bit, they can do it, and they do it. This is really common. Anywho, so this idea of utilizing the social environment, i.e., other humans, for subsistence, you know, it's not unique to peripatetics. Like, for instance, another influential pair, Salo and Salo, they actually point to sedentary merchants, landlords, or the providers of various services operating within the tertiary sector of the formal economy as the most common full-time exploiters of this, what they refer to as the socioeconomic niche. What makes peripatetics unique is that they use these human resources on a full-time basis as communities. So it's not one person who is engaged in a peripatetic kind of thing and all of his, like the rest of his or her family is doing something else, like agriculture. We're talking about whole communities. Yeah, I shouldn't keep this bit long, but basically, let me tell you these things. These are really, I mean, I find these really kind of informing and important. We often are told that these people do certain sort of are engaged in certain economic practices more than others, and like, you know, they're associated with certain things a lot. But basically the peripatetic adaptation scholars point out that this is all circumstantial in the sense that they, like peripatetic groups, offer a wide range of services and products which are frequently socially or economically inappropriate in more sedentary communities as full-time specializations. Hence, it's not always like, you know, it's not like they always go for the same things, but it's because certain occupations or certain kind of like sources of subsistence are either socially or economically unfeasible, they pursue those kinds of like occupations. What was the, I don't remember the English word. Oh, I think it's knife sharpening. I think it is knife sharpening. I find it a really good example to understand this. Imagine that you're a villager and you're a knife sharpener. How often do you reckon would you get work? You wouldn't. You need to go around. You need to go to different villages. You need to travel. Hence, you get a lot of knife sharpeners among peripatetics because they already are kind of navigating an area and they go from village to village and they sharpen knives as they go. And, you know, as you will see with most peripatetic groups, they are not focused on one thing. They do engage in a lot of different practices. They're really resourceful. They see something, they try it. If it works out, they continue. And if it doesn't work out, they can stop. Like they're often not invested too much. They are invested a lot in their occupations, obviously, but not as much as you would imagine. Well, anywho, so basically, if this is the peripatetic adaptation, and obviously if you want to know more about it, you can kind of like ask me at the end. But these categories, like the category names, I mean, this comes a lot in research on peripatetics, as in like research looking at peripatetics using the peripatetic adaptation as a theoretical framework. But you also get it elsewhere, right? All of these studies on gypsies, on the Roma, on other groups, they always talk about categories, they always talk about local names. And it's an interesting thing because there are numerous names all around the world. Even between two areas, you will find different names. And of course, you can ask what, I mean, you know, what's important about these names, but then they kind of reflect something about both the peripatetics and the non-peripatetics. They kind of show, I feel, how peripatetics fit within that kind of like ambiguous kind of like collective that we refer to as society, it shows you where they fit in a way. But anywho, let me just like sort of kind of tell you what the kind of interesting thing about these names are, like the names for peripatetics. So one important thing is that there is no set rule for the people these categories may refer to. So one person might identify a peripatetic person as X and another person might do that as Y, but that kind of goes against our understanding of names, right? I mean, it's kind of like someone identifying Mithat as a Kurd and someone else identifying him as French or something. Do you know what I mean? That doesn't really make sense to us in a way. Also, the boundaries change. The boundaries of these like categories, the names, who it refers to, but also like the scope of it changes, and the meanings change. You know, the same category name might mean different things elsewhere or whatever. I mean, these are really complicated, and I think a good example actually is the term nawar. I don't know if any of you heard it before. Those from Bashur may have, or from Rojava actually. So it's actually used, the term is used in parts of Syria, Palestine, and Egypt. And there's this scholar, Frank Meyer, who did research on peripatetics in various parts of Syria. And he explains it as like the term as designating a variety of heterogeneous ethnic groups. It's like, what does that mean? So like, there's this one term, and what does that refer to exactly? And then he gives us a chart, and he says it refers to Dom, it refers to Turkman, it refers to both Sunni and Shia Turkman, it refers to Abdals, it refers to Albans, it refers to Akrads, and it refers to Kaoli. So what does it mean exactly? Like, if it refers to so many different people, what can it possibly mean? But then there's the beauty of it, right? It means something for these people as well, and for the local Arabs, and probably the other people who cohabit in kind of communities in these areas. And maybe you can compare it to the Turkish word çingene. Maybe that would make sense. You know, like people kind of, it's a general term that I think roughly means gypsy, right? Like those are the boundaries. But once you go into it, then it becomes really complicated, because once you start researching it, you realize that these terms actually are used in different ways in different places. And there are different categories which only the locals kind of use, and like what going beyond the local area, then you don't get those words. I mean, like I'm currently in Thrace, and there are words such as mangosar and stuff like that here, and it refers to a category of peripatetics, and there's hierarchies and all sorts of things between these categories. But anywho, what I'm trying to say is that like this is interesting, and because I was studying peripatetics in Kurdistan, I became interested in this. Like, how does this work? And obviously, there's a few works that talk about peripatetics in Kurdistan. Mind you, nothing substantial. And like, I mean, let me just give you a few examples because they're quite interesting. So basically, two anthropological works talk about peripatetics in Kurdistan. And they're by quite famous people, actually. The first one is by Frederick Barth, and he published a book on the pastoralist Basri tribe. I think the book dates from 1956. And he dedicates 2 pages to the peripatetic lineages who spent part of the year with the Basri tribe. And he describes them as, quote, a small attached group of tinkers and smiths of a people dispersed through Persia, unquote. But then quickly adds that people make a distinction between 2 groups, known as Koli and Ghurbati. I don't know how these are pronounced, by the way. You know, it's in English transliteration, but it might be Koli and Ghurbati. He distinguishes between them on the basis that the Koli are more free wandering, trading in various types of easily transportable goods and without political patrons. And the latter, the Ghurbati, is attached to South Persian tribes. I mean, I find the wording really strange, to be completely honest. I thought about it when I was writing this bit for my PhD. But basically, he's kind of trying to say, in a way, that the main distinction is the presence and absence of patronage relations between these two groups. Martin van Brunessen actually talks about peripatetics in his book as well. He kind of makes this general statement where he claims that quite a number of gypsy-like groups exist as client lineages, unquote, to Kurdish tribes. And he actually adds that these people have extremely low status and are mostly nomadic, and do repair work, make seeds, brooms, etc., and are musicians. Basically, the only other kind of information he offers there is that the musicians, he says motrib in brackets, form a separate caste within the outcast group and do not intermarry with the others. And then in brackets, he says Karachi, and then comma, in quotes, gypsy. You know, like it's a complicated thing. I don't understand what's happening there. But the beautiful thing is, I will try to explain it to you because I think he got this from the area that I worked in. Because, you know, the Mêrdîn area is part of the kind of greater Jazeera area culturally. Anywho, so basically the distinction he offers is that, like, kind of slim, but you know, it's not a thick description in a way, but he says basically that one of the groups is musicians and the others, or even, you know, I find it interestingly, he says gypsy. So the musicians to him are not gypsy, whereas the others are. Anywho, what I find interesting is that these two anthropologists make a reference to patronage, and it's quite important, I think, because as I will show you, it's kind of quite key. It's quite crucial to understanding how these categories work in Kurdistan. There's one article that I saw that specifically talks about peripatetics in Kurdistan. It actually talks about peripatetics specifically in Diyarbakir. And it's a Turkish language article by anthropologist Adnan Çelik and Emre Şahin. I'm not sure whether he's an anthropologist too or not, but you guys might know Adnan. He writes he's quite prolific. He writes about a lot of subjects. They talk about the social position of peripatetics in Diyarbakir. Basically, this is the idea in that article. And what I found interesting there, especially, was that, I mean, they do identify the issue of patronage, and they do use really nice wording. I was quite sort of like happy about seeing that. They said in the patronage relations between peripatetics and the Kurds, the Kurds were positioned as patrons and peripatetics as subservients and indigents and dependents. And this is really important to identify. And as something that will come up later in my talk, they actually raise a key issue, and they say, and this is missing from Bath and Van Brunessen's accounts, that Kurds gave peripatetics charity. They actually refer to it as assistance, which is, I think, like the Turkish word kind of getting in the way there. Yardım, you know, it's kind of sometimes used as aid as well. And they say Kurds prioritized the peripatetics they knew more closely in these like sort of situations of charity given. Anywho, about categorization, what interested me is that they talked about quite briefly about sedentary gypsies, and they used the word gypsy, by the way, capitalized, sedentary gypsies and nomadic or mobile gypsies. And then they threw out two more words. They said mutrib gypsies and then Karachi gypsies. They don't tell us what these mean and how they kind of, whether they overlap, whether these are different, like 4 different kind of terms. We don't know. But I mean, there's a good reason we don't know, because the thing is that you need long-term ethnography to really understand what's happening there. It's really difficult. But I will do my best to now explain to you how this kind of came about with me. So I did my fieldwork in Mêrdîn in 2013 and 14, and it was during the summer of 2014 I started visiting Muhammad, a Kurdish man in his late 60s. He hails from a prominent lineage within a previously powerful tribe in the Tor area. And Tor refers to the area above the lowlands under Mêrdîn. So it's the mountainous area directly north of the Jazeera Plains, basically. And it's a large enough area. This guy was retired from a respectable position as a public servant, and he commanded considerable respect from people generally. So one time, when we were discussing certain issues regarding the peripatetics in the general area, the conversation moved into a discussion of the differences between the two categories of peripatetics, the only two categories identified in that area, Mutrbs and Qarachis. And I knew from the existing literature, part of which I kind of quoted for you, that local Kurds considered them to refer to two distinct categories of people, and distinguish them from each other often by the fact that Mutrbs played the kemaçe for a living, whereas Qarachis were engaged in sieve making and quote-unquote begging. However, it had been over a year since I began my field work, but Qarachis had come up only rarely in conversation with my peripatetic friends and acquaintances, who, when called to self-categorize, identify themselves either as Muttarb or in their own language as Dom. Besides, when Qarachis were mentioned, these people produced only general scathing remarks, unlike those expressed to me by the Kurds. Basically, as a result, I kept thinking at the time that, well, I guess Qarachis had become sedentary elsewhere. So they're not around anymore. These people are all Mutarbs, so the Qarachis must have gone somewhere else. So basically, it was this guy, Muhammad, who for the first time gave me the complete rundown of the perceived differences between these two categories of peripatetics. He said, Mutarbs were professional musicians, especially players of the three-string spike fiddle kemaçe. They had lighter skin complexion, comparable to that of the Kurds. They were sedentary in villages, and this is interesting, their morality was no different from that of the Kurds. His description of Qarachis was almost the opposite. It was antithetical. They begged to make a living, Qarachis. They were rush, i.e. dark-skinned. They were mobile. They lived in tents. And they were thought to live by an inferior moral code. In addition, our discussion revealed that Muhammad imagined these two categories, which comprised, by the way, distinct lineages, to be ancestral. So that is bound by origin, bound by their asl, their kok, and therefore belonging in either category was fixed. So you couldn't move between those categories, you know? You were born into a category, you stayed that way. They were different people, pretty much. As I said, this wasn't unfamiliar to me. I'd come across similar descriptions about the peripatetics in Mêrdîn per se. For instance, there's this PhD dissertation written by, I think, someone who's actually a lecturer in Diyarbakir now, for a long time, actually, Abdurrahim Osmani. In his PhD dissertation about, I think, Suryanis in the Tor area, he talked about these two groups, and he says, quote, when compared to a Muttarb by the other groups in the region, a Qarachi is someone who is dirty, aggressive, someone to stay away from. A Muttarb, however, is someone who knows how to dress, speak, and know proper etiquette. And then he goes, Qarachi begs while Muttarb asks for his share in return for a job he offered. So when I juxtaposed both of these kind of descriptions of these two categories with what I had observed in the Mêrdîn up until that time, their categorization struck me as a bit odd. No one in the Mêrdîn identified the kemaçe players and their families there as anything other than Muttarb. But these peripatetics all used to live in tents. Most had darker skin, at least according to Muhammad and other Kurds. And these people were also known to seek charity, i.e. beg. So, I mean, the peripatetics with whom I spent most of my time, actually, were invariably smartly dressed and followed the rules of etiquette to the letter. You know, like so how does this work? I was quite surprised actually, and I brought this discrepancy up with Muhammad, and he explains that the peripatetics, whom Kurds identified currently as mutirbs, were in reality Karachis, but since beginning to play the kemaçe, they were passing themselves off as mutirbs. But I mean, putting aside the possible merit of Muhammad's explanation, there is merit in it. But the reality around Nasibin at the time presented a picture that contradicted what he views as absolute truth, that membership in these categories is fixed, because people who don't think like him, who are the majority, consider these people mutirbs, not Karachis. Anyone under the age of 40 would say they are mutirbs, and they would say they're not Karachis at all. Like, I've had experiences with people who literally like sort of kind of like raise their voices saying that Karachis, no, they don't live here. These are all mutirbs and stuff like that. It's really strange. So Muhammad is bringing up something that seems like absolute truth, which is what he believes it's he considers it absolute truth. But the reality is that at the moment, this obviously is still valid today. Kurds in and around Nasibin, especially those under the age of 40, identify the local peripatetics exclusively as mutirb, and there's not a single lineage among these peripatetics which they identify as Karachi. So I met other people like Muhammad who hesitate to accept that membership in these categories has not been, or maybe is no longer fixed. And obviously, not obviously, but their explanation for this is that people, have forgotten the reality of the past. I guess a kind of cultural degeneration. We never talked a lot about it, so I'm gonna refrain from saying any more about it. But the interesting thing is that these people don't realize that they themselves have, they haven't remained unaffected by what's going on here. So I did an interview with this guy, Shoresh. These are all pseudonyms, by the way. And he's a Kurdish man in his early 40s, hailing from one of the lowland villages near Nasibin. In the interview, he's actually a journalist, by the way, and he cautioned me in our interview that people mistook Mutirbs and Karachis for each other, and that I should heed the distinction. And then he gave me the usual list of the differences, like the ones that I talked about just now. And then he named some of the Mutirb lineages he remembered visiting their village in the late 80s and 90s. And these lineages were, without an exception, formerly tent-dwelling peripatetics who made a living until that time by seeking charity in the Karachi fashion. So, this is a transformation that's like, that even affects the people who think, there's a transformation and these people are not Mutirbs. So basically something has changed, right? And put the former logic of categorization at odds with the present day reality. And I wanted to formulate an explanation for this. And I kind of talked about this in my PhD, obviously, because this was me trying to describe, like this was in chapter 2, me trying to explain who I'm talking about in the rest of this thesis. And this thing, it turned out to be quite difficult for me to formulate, but I realized that I need to add another dimension to the logic behind the categorization of peripatetics in the area. So as Kurds consider these categories as fixed, they also assume that a peripatetic individual, family, or lineage belonged at any given point to only one of these categories. And my ethnographic data contradicted this. For instance, the peripatetic lineage, which I refer to as House Bro, who Shoresh labeled the Mutirb lineage, Muhammad labeled Karachi. And the same applied to another lineage, House Bozo. Muhammad and Shoresh both quite sort of strongly and unambiguously described them as Karachis, whereas other people in the some lowland villages around Sabin, basically Shoresh's neighbors, identified them as Mutirbs and quite certainly, you know, and actually quite tellingly, they said they are our matrbs, matrbe ma. So basically that kind of like pushed me in a different kind of direction in a way. So like, how can the same peripatetic lineage, and by lineage, I mean, these are quite shallow lineages, like, you know, basically it's a kin group tracing their ancestry to a male, often a male ancestor. With peripatetics, there are a lot of female ancestors as well, actually. And these ancestors, these Baviks, are actually kind of like 4 generations back often. So they're not really deep lineages. But how can the same peripatetic lineage be identified by different Kurds, like as Matirb or Karachi, variously? So basically, I propose a simple answer. It's because these terms, though they refer on one level to 2 groups, also describe 2 different kinds of relationship. While Matirb basically marks the presence of patronage relations between a peripatetic kinship collective, lineage or sublineage, and a non-peripatetic one, Karachi marks the absence of patronage, or in fact, much of a relationship at all. And let me tell you how this kind of like worked out in my ethnography. So when I was talking to Shoresh, I mean, this came up a lot actually, but it's never identified as a distinguishing factor. Hence, it was hidden in our conversation, in conversations, in the kind of testimonies, the descriptions offered to me by the Kurds. So, like, there's a good example. It's a quotation from an interview that I did with Shoresh. So I asked them about the identities of the peripatetics who visited their village, and then the conversation that I'm going to quote now took place. So I asked, so the Mutars who came to your village, the Karachis who came, which lineages did they belong to? Do you remember that? And Shoresh responds, well, with the Karachis, you can't tell their lineages anyway. You can't trace them back. They're a bit different. They're mobile, Gerok, after all. They move around. So I ask, for instance, do you know any of their names, like individuals' names? And he goes, not the Karachis, no. I don't know the names of the Karachis. As I say, they used to come and stop at the edge of the village. No one would engage with them, really. They would come to the periphery of a village. They'd pitch their tents. They had hounds. They had tents. They had beasts of burden. And they'd go from house to house seeking charity. Their women would seek charity, or in Kurdish, the Gariyan. But Mutarbs aren't like that. Mutarbs are like tribes. By that, I mean they're recognized personalities. Khodi shakhsiyat, recognized characters, or in Kurdish, khodi karakter. And they do not seek charity everywhere, only on special days and from particular families. I mean, from wealthy and rich families, from village-owning families, leaders of tribes who are recognized as such. They have good relationships with them. So Shoresh's statement contains 2 important clues missing from the descriptions which I gave you earlier. Firstly, Karachis were strange people and Mutarbs were familiar. And secondly, Karachi women sought alms indiscriminately, going from house to house, whereas Mutarbs, in fact, specifically Mutarb men, sought charity only on specific occasions and from wealthy, influential, and powerful people. And although Shoresh doesn't make this connection, these 2 things are closely connected to each other. So, I mean, Shoresh's failure to identify the Karachi lineages who visited their village is not unique to him, by the way. I mean, I use this quotation, but this is actually a common thing. So the aspect of familiarity versus strangers are actually inbuilt to the relationships between non-peripatetics and peripatetics. And a good example of this is like the mother of a friend of mine, a Kurdish friend of mine, knew only the name of this peripatetic woman who had visited them weekly for at least a decade to ask for charity. Someone comes to your door and asks for charity, and you know her name. And her daughter, who came with her often, you know the daughter's name. And when I asked them, oh, so whose wife is she? She had no clue. No clue about the husband, no clue about the other children that she had. Only this one female child, and no idea about the male relatives, for instance. And in contrast, the same peripatetic family the parents of another Kurdish friend of mine literally relayed countless memories, anecdotes about the same peripatetic sublineage. They could easily supply me with enough information to make a comprehensive kinship chart, like spanning 3 generations maybe, and including both a final and consanguinal kin, like both marriage, like kinship by marriage, and blood relatives. Like, do you see the kind of like the discrepancy between those things? And these are the same, like the peripatetics are exactly the same people, right? It's this peripatetic woman and basically the lineage that she's basically from. And these 2 Kurdish people that I talk about, they're peers. They're of the same age group and from a similar social and cultural background, basically. And nothing to produce this kind of discrepancy. The striking difference is that this peripatetic woman that I talked about, she did not seek charity from the people who knew her family very well. It's the male relatives who did. Hence, maybe you realize it's going back to the Mutter men seek whatever, and like Karachi women seek arms, that business. Actually, the familiar stranger dichotomy begins to make more sense when the second point from Shoreh's quotation is taken into the analysis. Maybe you noticed in the quotation from Osman in the previous kind of section, let's call it. He said, Karachi begs while Mutrab asks for his share in return for a job he offered. And what's missing from this account is that the distinction between begging versus asking for one's share pertains strictly to peripatetic practices of charity seeking. So this asking for one share is not because they do a job and they get paid for it. These are gifts given to them. It looks like they're doing a job, but they're actually conceptualized differently. They're conceptualized as gifts rather than alms, and I'll briefly explain it. But let me kind of give you this. Maybe this will be helpful to clarify. So when we talk about Karachis, women knock on doors to solicit charity. And this is the most common practice. There are other ones, but this is the most common one. And the charity is in the form of food. And this used to happen when they pitched their tents near a village. The women would go, knock on doors, collect charity. Men would keep to themselves, and they wouldn't really socialize with the village men in a way. With muterbs, however, it was men who sought charity only on specific occasions, including occasions like kurbun, when a baby boy is born into a family. It's kind of obsolete now, but it used to be a significant event. Or when a bride is being brought to the groom's village, bukanin, or on religious festivals like the Muslim Eids or the Christian Easter, or following cereal and vine harvests. And men would turn up for such operations in pairs often, only as men, and women wouldn't come. So in one case, it's just men, and in the other context, it's just women, and the contexts are different, the practices are gendered, and the terms are different, right? The categories are different. So basically, well, maybe this will also clarify what I meant by gifts and charity. When women are given charity, it falls into the category of sadaqah, which in Kurdish, the term that is used very often is khair. It refers to religious alms, basically, but it's the Islamic form of charity known as sadaqah. With mutribs, however, it's hardly ever conceptualized as khair. It's not sadaqah. It's either conceptualized as khalat or bakhshish. And khalat, as you might know, is just gifts, right? Basically, these differences are quite substantial in a way. But the interesting thing is that what I realized is, I don't know since when, but this went on. This still goes on. It did not, it's not in the past. It still goes on. Since when, I don't know. But what happens is, these people that Kurds identified largely as Karachis, which refers to Muhammad's distinction, right? And Abdurrahim Osman's distinction. They began to form patronage relations with the Kurds. And I'll briefly tell you a few pieces of evidence that confirms this. They start forming patronage relations. But imagine this, your patrons are, say, these villages, 2 villages, let's say, or 3 villages, or 1 village. Everyone else is not your patron. So when you're visiting your patron, you become a matar. When you're not visiting your patron, you become a Karachi. It's pretty simple, actually. So they can actually shift between different modes, different relationships in a way. That's why you get all this confusion, right? But when you do ethnography, no one tells you anything like this, because they either don't realize it or they don't believe it in a way, because, you know, like Muhammad's explanation, right? He goes, well, they're actually Karachis. They're just trying to pass themselves as Mutaribs. But the reality is everyone's accepted them as Mutaribs now. And the funny thing is the 2 categories have merged. So when you talk to like young people now, if you ask them what, like, oh, who are the Mutaribs? What do? They will tell you that Mutarib women seek charity, but men are musicians, but also men seek gifts. But they're all dark skins. They're from Pakistan or something. You know what? Like the whole thing has merged into like each other. And I mean, yeah, there's a lot more to say, but I think I need to kind of start wrapping this up now. So what I realized when I kind of like started asking questions about musicians in these lineages is that the musicians didn't go beyond a certain generation. And people were quite hesitant to admit this. They just wouldn't, like, so men born roughly in the 1930s, after the 1930s, you can see kemaçe players, musicians. Before then, there's no one. And, you know, people don't want to admit it because they've been saying that it's an ancestral job, it's an ancestral occupation. Or we've been musicians, you know, it's our ancestors, we've been musicians since their time. Not really. I realized that it's after the 1930s, roughly. And the funny thing is, well, maybe I can close on this, and if I've left anything kind of like, you know, if I've left any loose threads, you can ask me questions. What I've realized is that the lineages who can actually count musicians before those kind of like, before the generations born before the 1930s, there is a few lineages. And I realized, I think, some of them have become non-peripatetic. Some of them became urbanized. Urbanized meaning in the towns in that area, such as, I think there are cases in Karjos, Karburan, probably in Midyat as well. They became non-peripatetic. They started passing as Kurds. And there are 2 lineages who don't do that. They are still peripatetic in a way. But the strange thing, and I know some of you will find this interesting, is that all of these people who used to live in tents and shifted from being sieve makers, beggars, they identify as Dom. And the ones who are the original Mutaribs, the authentic Mutaribs, as some people want to say, they say they're not Dom. So there are different layers of peripatetic kind of like existence in the area. I don't know how that came about, but let me finish on this kind of pattern where you see categories distinguished from one another by patronage versus the absence of patronage, by familiarity versus strangeness, by even like trustworthiness versus, you know, kind of like precarious people, you know, like potential thieves, potential whatevers. This kind of pattern seems to exist across Kurdistan. And I think the binary categorization, as in like 2 groups, that's also quite common, although as Sarah might attest, there are 3 groups in some areas, like around Urfa. I mean, I interviewed one adult man, and he identified 3 groups, and there might be tertiary categorization. But the issue of patronage is super important, and maybe as the case that I kind of talked about here shows, these names, these categories are not fixed. They change, they transform, they're fluid. And the more we want to deny that, the more we kind of like refuse to actually kind of appreciate what's happening there. Well, I'll stop here, and maybe you guys will, you know, kind of ask me the questions where I kind of like left major gaps, because I know I have. But yeah, thank you for listening, guys.
Thank you very much, Argun. You once again presented in such a mild, almost conversational style, but gave a lot. I mean, despite so many one-to-one talks that we had, I've learned so many new things this evening on this topic. Thank you very much for this in-depth presentation. I would like to open the floor for questions, or I could use my position of chair, ask first question myself. If you have any questions, I will probably ask you to ask the question yourself. If possible, turn your camera on. That makes it sort of more interactive style. There is a hand up here. Let me see who. Keki Weisi Chia, the floor is yours. Let me. Oh yeah, okay. You can unmute yourself. Yeah, go ahead, please.
Many thanks for your presentation, Argun. I mean, it was very interesting, and I've got actually 2 questions. The first question, I mean, I don't know, maybe you indicated, so what drives you to investigate this relationship of all peripheral groups, including the Kurds as well, actually, because the Kurds, like, you know, they are, I mean, it was more about the relationship or interaction between the Kurds, the Terp and Qadhi in you. I'm from Mardin as well, actually, from the region. So, and what I mean, you are, because you're from Turkey, like the part of Turkish, the majority, let's say, investigating this particular cases, you know, which are kind of all discriminated actually. But then what drives you to actually investigate, and what was the purpose? That's interesting for me. And the second question, you know, you you actually described and analyzed how this kind of, you know, this all groups who are discriminated, who are peripheral, who are at the periphery of them, you know, in Turkey, because the Turkey is there, the Turkish military, Turkish state is kind. Also, we have to talk about the colonialism. I mean, how the Turkish state, the Turkish, let's say, the power shaped this relationship between these different groups, you know, whether the Turkish state itself or the Turkish policy create this antagonistic relationship between these different groups. Because what I understood that you try to analyze the, you know, to actually to describe these groups like who are peripheral from the lens of the Kurds, but how this the majority, let's say, the superiority of the Turkish state in the region affects or shape this relationship.
Okay, yeah, great questions. Thank you. I'm having to ask now. So basically the answer to your first question is that well, you know, I'll keep it brief. I talk about this a lot, I think. I started by studying Dengbej, right? And basically I realized that Meterbs were a category of musicians. That's how I started, and I wanted to study musicians. Then I realized I was more interested in this whole kind of like large scale kind of shift, because I could see that there were these things, all of these things, and this whole, the disclosure of dominance business was happening when I was there. I mean, it was happening 6 months before I went there, and I realized that like there was a lot to look at, and musicians weren't really interesting for me anymore. That's how I started studying it. But maybe this connects with your second question as well. The way I looked at, or the way I became interested, was not because I imagined I was looking at subalterns. I wasn't looking at patterns of discrimination or structures of discrimination in a way. I sometimes feel that I actually kind of like, you know, when you pull yourself away too much and the emotion disappears, and then you kind of like start seeing the structure and you move around within it, and the emotion is necessary. And I think I sometimes don't bring it in as much as I want. But the reason I say all of this is because this became an anthropological interest, in the sense that you can see all sorts of tension, not always negative. I talked about, I don't think I've emphasized negative issues a lot anyway. We didn't talk about discrimination, and it is a big thing. But I think the literature is actually full of the marginalization kind of approach. And I think this is more realistic, because the marginalization approach, I often feel that like it takes away agency. It creates well, it presents a picture of peripatetics as powerless, and they're not powerless. They have power, certain symbolic kinds of power, but they do use it, and they do use it wisely and well. And I just don't want to talk about it in those terms. And the way this connects with your second question is that the funny thing is, maybe, I mean, you can maybe confirm this or, you know, disagree with me. In the eyes of the Turkish state, I don't think there's any difference between the Kurds and the peripatetics in Kurdistan. They don't distinguish, because they don't care. You know, it doesn't fit their idea of who is who, right? If they want to categorize, I remember, I mean, people talked about encounters with soldiers or korujis, village guards. And obviously, like, you know, they identify themselves when they're not recognized, to especially like Turkish soldiers, as, oh, we're gypsies, you know, like, we're gypsies, so just don't mess with us, kind of thing. And I've heard a lot of stories of even life-threatening situations basically brought about by soldiers or korujus, you know, like village guards. These things are real, but the dynamics of the relationship between the people in that area, generally the non-peripatetics in that area, and I keep saying the Kurds, but as I said in the beginning of the talk, the Suryanis are part of this, and, you know, both Muslim and Yazidi Kurds are part of this. Like, and these distinctions are important because there are differences, but in these relationships, you can see a pattern that I feel is not necessarily affected by, like, the antagonism that you might see is not actually part of the fact that it's a colonized land. These patterns are seen everywhere around the world. It's one of the things we can kind of say, like, oh, you know, this actually repeats itself. This is like basically the deteriorate. For instance, I analyzed this, and maybe I should kind of summarize this really quickly for you, because it's quite interesting. The reason the relationships started to deteriorate is largely because the element of custom is eroding. And custom is the main thing that holds the patronage relations together. And custom, combined with lack of familiarity, and by familiarity, I mean these people used to visit their patrons in the past, now they don't. There's no kind of framework for it, right? So, I mean, that you can talk about all sorts of indirect influences, but I see that the erosion of custom and basically maybe a change in lifestyle, like urban migration and all that, which is obviously largely caused by the Turkish state. Those seem to be the main reasons between the kind of like the deterioration. Like maybe you actually know this as a local, when like in the past, when Mutr would appear and ask for his bahr, for his share, if he was known, if people knew him, they'd be like, oh, this is shameful, we need to give him something, and we need to give him something good, right? Nowadays, when you go, they say, why don't you work for a living? Why do you come and beg? This is part of the erosion of custom, because custom dictated that the Mutr your mutr who would come and ask you something, you'd give it. And you would give it. A lot of people would give it. They wouldn't argue. There were structural reasons why you wouldn't argue, because they would potentially talk about you, right? They would, you know, they could speak ill about you in other javats, whatever. I mean, it's a long answer, I know, but it's a really complicated story. And you're right. There's a hand of the Turkish state, because obviously colonization does that. But I saw that the deterioration mainly owed to other things.
Thank you very much, Argun, and thank you, Dr. Waisi. I just would like to take this opportunity to remind or inform you guys that Dr. Waisi Chia will also deliver a speech for us in a seminar on 22nd of July. Correct me if I'm wrong. The topic will be Kurds around Kurds in diaspora. So keep following the page here. We will soon prepare the announcements and announce it on Kurd-Akad social media pages. Thank you again. Sarah was the first one who wanted to speak. Sarah, the floor is yours. Go ahead, please.
Thank you very much. Well, first of all, thank you, Argun. You know that this is very interesting for me and for probably many others. But I'm really happy to attend, and really happy to see how deeply you've developed some of those very, very, very complex terminological and well, anthropological links between those communities. And I'd more than ask a question, like ask you to develop a little bit more on. At the very end, you like introduce the word dom to talk about different layers of peripatetics and how I haven't didn't exactly get the point on how dom go through those two terms, mitrib and karaji, and which terms they are linked. But and this is my first please thing I want from you, and I'll add a question myself that might be related to these, that it is related to these, and it is that myself, you know, that I have deal with dom with this term later on my fieldwork, and I have found that, and at almost the very end, I have in my fieldwork now, it seems that, which is Urfa, wedding musicians, as you know, I have the feeling that dom is becoming something that has to do with a new wedding musician pride in at least in Urfa. How to I'll try to explain myself, and sorry because of my broken English. But when I ask my musicians, my wedding musicians, which are in Urfa, name as gewende most of the times, to Kurds, to them, which would be similar to your mitrib in Mardin, I guess. They would say, yeah, well, you know that we are dom, and for them, when I ask what does it come from and what is the origin of their language, etc., they would say, well, no, we don't. Yeah, technical language, kind of. I mean, they would use it only in their for them. I mean, they would only use it in their context, in their musical context, when they talk about their music, etc. And he was trying to convince me that dom was not anything ethnical, but just a synonym for him of davulcu, of wedding musician. And the fact that they use words, different words that they, as you know, they mix into Kurdish grammar, it's just not important. It's just something part of it's technical words they use, and somehow, well, he was trying to saying to me that, well, that they are Kurds. Of course, that they are Kurds. He was insisting very much in the fact that they are Kurds, but they're Dom Kurds, and it means those who can play music. And then there was when I found out that they invite me to this Facebook group where they share their most liked videos, and that group was like Dom of Turkey, like trying to gather with other Dom and find each other. And I appreciate in the way he was talking pride on that term, you know. And I guess this might be something that is building up now, so like something to kind of find their way into that very complex relationships with patronage relationships with Kurds, and the way sometimes they have been treated. Anyway, I don't know if I was clear.
I think I understand the second question.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I understand your second question. The first question though, can I just clarify if I get it right? You asked what terms like Mıtırıp and Karachi mean for the peripatetics themselves. Was that the general idea about the question? The first question.
Well, I was asking more like at the very end you said like, well, Dom is when you I mean, which of these two groups call themselves Dom? I didn't get it. And yeah, that was a little bit.
Okay. Yeah, I'll do my best. Tough questions, guys. Wacy as well now, Sarah. So basically the ones, let's not use the terms Mıtırıp and Karachi, but if you identify the two categories on the basis of, say, mobility and all that, the people who used to live in tents, the people who used to make sieves and were identified as beggars, they refer to themselves as Dom. But obviously all of those people are Mıtırıp now, right? So that's the distinction, I guess, in a way. The lineages who didn't do those things, as far as we know, didn't do those things, they don't actually identify as Dom. Yeah, I mean, they actually don't like people talking about it very much either, because because people generalize about everything. Like when the word Dom appeared, all the peripatetics in Kurdistan became Dom, and it's like, well, some of them aren't. It's just that's the way it is, and people get annoyed with me because I keep saying peripatetics instead of like Dom. I mean, I annoyed someone just a few weeks back. The reality is they're not all Dom. I can't do that. That's ridiculous. But we want to simplify things, so and hence they became Doms, the Middle Eastern gypsies, whatever. Anywho, but the second question is like, I think we may have even talked about this before, right? It's a difficult one, but like some of the important things I've realized is that, which is kind of surprising, the term Dom, the word Dom, and the word Mıtırıp is synonymous. It's exactly the same thing. When you talk to peripatetics the way that I did, because I stayed with the same kind of lineage. We became friends. I mean, I've got a kirve now, kriv. So I became a different kind of stranger, right? I'm the kind of stranger who didn't go away in a way, but kept being strange. But so basically I realized that they used the word Dom in the exact same way that they use the word Mıtırıp. Like even in the negative, when quoting a Kurdish person who, for instance, kind of insulted them, saying like, oh, these Mıtırıps, they come here and they do this, they should never come here, whatever. Or like these Mıtırıps, they're all thieves. When they talk to me, because obviously the terminology we use is slightly different, like me and the peripatetics, rather than a stranger or rather than a non-peripatetic being there. They would just say like, oh yeah, I went there and the guy said, oh, these Doms, they come here and they whatever. And there are different examples of this, like not the same example, but I kept thinking about this because I was curious about what Dom meant, because it did not mean what we think it means in a way. It's more complicated. And then there's obviously the ethnic claim, and it is an ethnic claim. And I understand that your informants or friends are hesitant about it. But the reality is that when these claims were being made initially in the documentary Dom, for instance, the wording was quite familiar. It went like, oh, you know, there are Kurds, there are the Lars, there are the whatever, and the Kurds speak Kurdish, the Lars speak, you know, Lazuri, whatever, and we are Dom, and we speak Domani, but they treat us badly, and we are a nation like the others, you know. Basically a claim for recognition and respect. It was so obvious, and the wording was exactly the same wording that kind of is kind of the mainstream claim for recognition by the Kurds. You know, we have a language, we're a people. Just, you know, let us be a people, which obviously, you know, in Turkey, I don't think the state or even people have come to terms with it, really. So DOMs were doing exactly the same thing, and I heard them repeat Kurdish discourses to me where, you know, the actors were changed. You know, I've had some people say to me like, oh, well, you know, Kurds complain about the Turkish state, we complain about the Kurds. It's like, okay, I see what you're trying to do. And I can see that, but also that discourse, the Domness thing is limited to a certain audience. They don't do this with everybody. They don't talk about Domness with Kurds generally, unless it's a young, educated, politically aware Kurdish person. So, you know, get a 60-year-old Kurdish neighbor, they don't talk about Domness. They don't say the word. They change the words. Someone asked, like one time, someone asked, I was recording a kemaçe player in his 50s, and he was on the phone with the guy who he was recording for. And the guy says, oh, yeah, so he says, like, I have a guest here from England. And then the guy says, oh, what is he doing there? And he just like goes, what do you do here? He knows I'm researching them, right? But it's such a foreign concept. And I said, well, I'm researching DOMs. And he just like sort of like paused for a second and went, he researches Kurmanji. And I was like, yeah, I understand. You don't want to become a stranger. And that's the thing. Domness means strangeness. Domness means you're a foreign person, you're a foreign group of people. And they don't want it because as much as materness involves forms of structural violence and domination, it still means familiarity, I think, and it helps being familiar. It helps with all sorts of things. I mean, I'm not going to detail it, but all this going and asking for gifts on Eids and, you know, like on Easter, whatever, that depends on being familiar, you know, and Domness kind of takes that away. And Kurdishness is actually useful. And I'm not saying they're not Kurds. It's a semantic distinction. Like in one of the interviews I gave, specifically I used these words. I said Doms are a native people of Kurdistan, because these people that we're talking about have been there for several hundred years. I think that makes you native. They speak, you know, their language is mainly Kurdish. They know the territory, the terrain, as well as the Kurds themselves or the other groups there. And, you know, the Domness comes with an element of foreignness that I think some people don't want. That's basically it. And hence the confusion or the tension. Sorry, that was a long answer. I think you're muted.
Sorry. Thank you, Argun and Sarah. Mustafa Hamo, please go ahead with your question. If you unmute yourself, please.
Okay. زور سپاس سعادت خوش شماره تا. Thanks a lot. Kak Argun, I'm from Rojava, I'm from Afrin. You mixed between Kauli and Qurbat and Nawar. These are different groups. Because during based on my personal experience, the Kauli in Iraq, by the way, they have a sad story. Because they were musicians and singers, and Saddam Hussein regime was at the top. The second man in the regime have have some videos with them. They are singing and dancing. And when the Saddam were removed, the whole community was eliminated. They were eliminated from Iraq, and there's many of them left, fled to Syria. But in terms of from an anthropological point of view, the only category we can say they are distinct and they are totally different from Kurds, they are Qurbat or the Gypsies or Karachi. They are same group. Although they have transformed over time because their position in the society has changed, or that the economy or social structure changed. They changed also, just like any class in the society. But the mutrab, in Afrin we call it krif. In Koban they call them gawanda. In Qamish they call them mutrab also. But this group, although they are performing a specific job in the society, which they inherit generation after generation, they became a little bit a different class or a group in themselves, and they have no other ethnicity rather than Kurdish. They speak Kurdish. They identify themselves as Kurds. So while in Turkey they are called Dom. What does mean Dom? Dom is the mutrab. Mutrab or cannot be different class or different group. I mean, different group from Kurds.
That's a very good question, and the answer is, as I kind of tried to say, these terms are fluid. These names are fluid. So what you refer to as matrib has a different life in another region. Maybe they were similar people, but they transformed. Things kind of like, things change. So like, it's quite interesting. I've never had a conversation with someone from Afrin. And it's really kind of interesting to hear that the Kauli and Qurbat are familiar to you, but also Nawar, obviously, as I was saying, it's
Nawar. They are called Nawar.
Huh?
They are called Nawar. Nawar.
Okay. I mean, yeah, I can't pronounce it. Sorry, it's an Arabic word, isn't it? Yeah. Basically, I mean, all I can say about this is that the dominus thing, there's an interesting thing about it which you should know, which is hard to know because all peripatetics are quite secretive. Like, secretiveness is an element of peripatetic adaptation. It's very helpful. It's very useful. If you're an outnumbered small group moving between different peoples as your customers / patrons, secrecy helps. And by secrecy, I'm also referring to the fact that they don't tell people that they identify as Dom. This is just the reality of the situation. This is like confirmed over and over again. Like, this is the interesting thing. We hadn't heard the term Dom 15 years ago. And now, like, after I started studying Doms, a young kid from Mush communicated with me. And he said, "Oh, I'm Dom. I want to meet you." I met him. A massive community of Doms in the Sarhad area. Do you reckon the Sarhad Kurds know about it? Not really, they don't. And the Mêrdîn, same thing. Urfa, the same thing. So this element of secrecy there is that they didn't used to tell the Kurds that they identified as Dom. And part of it is because they speak a language which also has to remain a secret because it's helpful. These are really common things, by the way. Don't think that this is unique to these people or Kurdistan. This is really general. Like, a lot of peripatetics have secret languages. Sometimes they are not actual like languages like Domani, like Domani and Romani, these are actually like, there are languages like that. It's not just a lexicon, but like, what's it called? Rotwelsch, I think. It's a secret language used by peripatetics and other people in Germany and Austria, I think, before this, or even after the Second World War. So these are common kind of like phenomena. And the idea of matribs being locals and stuff, there is an interesting thing, which I'm not going to contest what you said, because that seems to be the common understanding, that it's sometimes matribs, it's sometimes another group. People say they're not foreign. they're actually locals, they're like us. Yes, but there's no intermarriage. And that is interesting because lack of intermarriage often points to something quite substantial about group boundaries. You can't not marry a group and say we are the same. I mean, in the modern world, we can say anything and it's fine. But this didn't used to happen, I think, like 100 years ago. But, you know, like we never marry them, but we're the same people. You know, not in the Middle East, I think. I mean, I'm generalizing and I might be really terribly wrong, but you know what I mean? If there's lack of marriage, then you're keeping the boundaries of your group relatively clean off of each other. And obviously in practice, it's not like that, but I can see that the idea of one of the categories being close to the Kurds, similar to the Kurds, is part of the logic of categorization. It's part of the logic of some of the peripatetic groups kind of coming closer to the Kurds. But I can't say anything more than that. This requires a lot of like general research in Kurdistan, I think, because I would love to know about all the different areas in Kurdistan, because you know they all tell a different story, but there are really important commonalities. I hope I could answer your question.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you very much, both again. Now, George Murer has raised his hand. George, yes, please. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Wow, very, very, very interesting presentation, Argun. I just was wondering if you might address a little bit this close relationship between the kemaçe and associated repertoires and the sort of designation method, especially within the sort of spheres of wedding music. In particular, I'm thinking about the fact that in many of the surrounding region, at weddings, it's very common to have, in the past in particular, to have the zurna and davul or dol accompanying dances. And increasingly, those players of those instruments have kind of been taken over. Their roles have been kind of supplanted by electro-balama players, the young Kurds, essentially, who identify very much as Kurds, are identified as Kurds, as opposed to the sort of kind of marginal status that these hereditary musicians tended to have. But then, in the case of the Maturbs you're talking about in the Nusaybin area and Mithat and Mêrdîn, there isn't so much an easy, porous passage for that repertoire to be taken over by these, as much as there are overtures to incorporate those dances and the aesthetics of the kemaçe. I think it still, for the most part, remains the domain of the Maturbs, right, of that kind of group, which is very different than the case of like, zurna driven melodies that then get adapted to electro-balama and so forth in like, Ahmed and all throughout the whole region.
Yes, another difficult question. Thank you, George. By the way, George actually researches that, please correct me if I'm wrong, but around the Ahmed Derik, that area, right? And obviously the extension of it. So we have kind of complementary study areas in a way. So the interesting thing about the Tor area and the surrounding area, and part of it overlaps with what you study, George, is that the Tor area is characterized in terms of professional music making by kemaçe players. It's associated with kemaçe players, plus Dahul and Zurna ensembles, right? And the interesting thing about the overlap between peripatetics and those things, and it seems, I mean, this is just coming from my ethnography, and I think it needs to be much broader, even within that area. But the Dahul and Zurna playing lineages, it seems, these old sedentary, or for want of a better word, original Maturbs, they used to play kemaçe and Dahul and Zurna. They had all of those instruments within their ranks. Then it seems one of the tent-dwelling lineages picked up the Dahul and Zurna. Just one, not the others. I don't know why. But kemaçe playing, the other ones picked up as well. So that's a strange kind of expand, but that's how it kind of came about. And maybe for people who are not familiar with the area, they should know that like professional music making, and by professional, I mean at the time by being given gifts, not by fees, that they didn't used to be fees. You know, you wouldn't negotiate a fee to play at a wedding until maybe the 70s or 80s. You would be given gifts for your performances. Professional music making in that sense, as an economic practice, was monopolized by peripatetics because it was shameful. It's just like the other people in the area considered it ayıp, or kemaçe. So you would get Dengbeş type performers who are referred to as strambes in this area, who used to sing in their villages among people who are, you know, they're kind of like villagers and stuff. They wouldn't get gifts, and it wasn't shameful, but you wouldn't go and sing at weddings like professionally in that sense. So what's happening there is that kemaçe becomes really popular. The Hollands are not playing, not that popular somehow. The interesting thing about the story of wedding music in this area is that the Hollands are not lost, like almost became completely obsolete, which is weird. When I went there in 2013, there were little sparks, just little sparks. None of the peripatetics I knew played them. The lineage who was famous for playing the Holland Zurna in the Mêrdîn had almost nobody anymore. The famous the Holland Zurna players didn't go to weddings anymore. They were old, 70 something, I think. One of them is a 50-year-old the whole player, but he doesn't play the whole anymore. And it was the Kurds picking it up. And the interesting thing about this whole story about the kemaçe and wedding music is in this area is that kemaçe is such a taboo. It is still such a taboo that Kurds in the area don't play it. I mean, there's all sorts of stories, you know, like it's like, you know, half jokes, half stories about, oh, if you touch that instrument, you'll become a mıtır. But you hear this all the time. Mithat smiling. Have you heard that before? And you can see that, you can hear this in other people's testimonies, like musicians' testimonies. Shivan Parwer talks about this. When he makes a tambur for himself, his father goes, oh, is my kid going to become a karachi or mıtır? Or I don't know, it was an interview in Turkey, so I don't know, maybe he said Gowanda. This is just common, right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question right, but basically that's why in this area, the entrance of Kurds into wedding music, that scene, has been through the tambur, because it doesn't have that kind of stigma on it. And yeah, so basically there's no stigma on it as such. So if you're a kemaçe player, it's really terrible. If you're a tambur player, you know, you've got really important examples. Obviously, we're talking about an age where the radio is becoming popular in the 60s and everything. You hear a lot of tambur players who seem to be well-respected people, right? I mean, they are famous, they are respected, they, you know, which kind of goes against the locals' idea of music making, because anyone who's a musician is a mıtır. It's only good enough for the mıtırbs, not for the Kurds, not for the Ashir, you know, not for tribal Kurds, not for anyone really. But anyhow, it's super interesting that it's become through the tambur, and then the Dahol and Zurna. I see Kurdish Dahol players nowadays. I don't know about Zurna players. Maybe you know. I haven't seen any in around the Mêrdîn. I haven't seen any Zurna players around the Mêrdîn, which is strange. But yeah, it's become like, I feel like the tamburs become the Kurdish equivalent of the kemaçe in terms of wedding music. But some people still really like the kemaçe because it gives a different taste when you dance to it. And the old timers know that. Some of the young generation know that. So they still invite kemaçe players to their weddings. But in general, I think, you know this already, I suppose, there's great competition, and peripatetics are losing. Kurds are winning that competition.
Yes, Argun, you're right. Caused me smiling there, because I was thinking if that's a decisive point over the years, you have become a very good mıtır, because I know you play very good kemaçe, so. We're kind of done with the time, but just if you have a brief answer to this. I know the question itself could be quite a wide one. I wonder how they, the us and others elements is shifted mainly among themselves. I know you've used two different names mainly for that region, Materb and Karachi. Do they see each other? Is there a clear line between the two in the same region? And also how they see the Materbs of or Karachis of that wider region, say Kurdistan of Turkey. Thank you.
Yeah, and you're talking about the local peripatetics, right? Just checking.
Yeah.
So okay, this is the interesting thing. So even someone who's 60-year-old, a peripatetic person who's 60-year-old, grew up as a Materb. That's just given. But at the same time, they do subscribe to the way that Kurds distinguish between the two groups. It's not just the Kurds, it's the peripatetics as well. But there's an element of, I don't know, like, I don't want to call it humor. I mean, there's a good word for it, I'm sure, but my English doesn't, suffice. What happens is that when you ask someone like who's from the Materb community who lives in the Mêrdîn, who are all from tent-dwelling backgrounds, if you go, well, who are the Karachis? They kind of hesitate. And then you get really strange answers sometimes. Like one of my friends said, for instance, he said, oh, well, Karachi women go and seek charity. That's the main difference. Like with Karachis, women seek charity. With Materbs, it's just men. And then there's this like smirk. Do you know the reason? Because his mum seeks charity. And he's trying to tell me that they are all Materb. And it's just like there's all this like weird, once you realize things, it becomes difficult to kind of like hold that face, right? So obviously, because they are the people who went through the transformation, because they are the people who are subjected to these terms, they use them. But at the same time, we should never forget that these are the weak parties in terms of the politics, right, of this. So they are they have to accept the terms. They contest them, obviously, in their own ways, which they have been doing. But also they subscribe to the same terminology. And basically what I'm trying to say is that it's difficult to get a definition of what, like the differences between Karachis and Materbs from someone who's a peripatetic and from a peripatetic lineage in the Mêrdîn. At the same time, there are still peripatetics who come to the Mêrdîn at certain times of the year, generally around harvest time, right? Because that's when people are giving their zakah. Hence they go and like ask for zakah. And according to Islam, you can't distinguish between people on the basis that you know them or not. Like it doesn't matter. You have to give your zakat to someone asking, as long as they are poor and married and Muslim. And these guys come and they ask for crops and they are given crops, and like they are the obvious Karachis at the moment, because like when you ask people, this is the interesting thing, right? So you go and ask your peripatetic friends, oh, who are these people in these tents who have just like who've just pitched their tents across the road, and they go, they're all from Urfa. And that's the thing, they say they're all from Urfa. So which I mean, there's truth in it, but yeah, I guess what I'm trying to say is that like it's really complicated when you talk to peripatetics. If they know that you're not trying to insult them, Materb is still an okay term, because it's a term that denotes origins. And a lot of people say, well, I'm a Materb, and they say stuff like, well, you can't wash it off yourself with 7 soaps. That's the Kurdish thing, right? That's the Kurdish expression that they used to use. So they're trying to say it's my origins, and I'm okay with it. I'm Materb. But yeah, it's more complicated than that, I guess.
Okay, thank you very, very much, Argun. As I said, personally, I've really benefited a lot from it. I'm sure those in this Zoom room have done the same, because as I see, not really anybody have left since the beginning. That's always seen as a good sign. And just a final reminders about our upcoming seminar, which is the last seminar of our series before the summer holiday. For those of you who follow us, you will know that we've tried to have a seminar on average every other week, fortnightly. The last one of which will be on 22nd of July by Dr. Waisichia, who is among us this evening. And the title will be The Politics of Cultural Production and Belonging, Refugeedom, Exile and Integration in Europe's Kurdish Diaspora. And then after that, we'll say goodbye for summer holiday until September, when we come back to the business. We are in talks to organize a sort of social event, if the conditions allow here in the UK, to bring our members together over an activity. I'll leave it there because we're still talking on it. I don't know myself how it's going to finalize there. And within this year, we'll probably have our second Congress where we elect the new committee. These are just tips of upcoming events. And I want to end here with thanking Argun Çakir, Dr. Argun Çakir, again for your time that you devoted for this. And thank you all here this evening. I know with sort of tiredom of this pandemic era, hopefully when we come for September, we won't be talking much about this anymore, but also the summer conditions. Those of you who've taken their time and joined us this evening, I'd like to thank you all. Spasikum u ibara ve خوشی u stay safe. Thank you all. Until next time.